Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. I'm Jonathan Ball, your host. And I want to start this episode with a little bit of a preamble and just sort of let you know a couple of things I'm up to at the moment and what I'm up to recently. Bit of a preamble, and then what we're going to dig into here in this episode is the topic of what does the reader want? How do you deal with what the reader wants? How do you know what the reader wants? And what are just some techniques related to the sticky question? It's a more complicated issue than it seems, I think, at first. The sticky question, the sticky issue of what the reader wants, and should you give the reader what they want? There's sort of two things connected there. Another way you can think about this is satisfying the reader. There's a level where you have to struggle as a writer, I think, or you do struggle with the writer, especially early on, with this issue of what you think you need to do to satisfy the reader. One of the issues you get into very quickly with writing is this question of satisfying the reader, because fundamentally, I don't think a lot of writers know what the reader wants. And so one of the problems you get into in that scenario is you can be giving the reader things they don't want. You can fail to give the reader things they do want. And you can actually end up in a bad position where you're doing what the reader thinks they want. You know, there's sort of a set of nested issues that I think are worth digging into. Before we do it, like I say, I want to just do a little bit of preamble and talk about some of the things that are going on. And so one of the things that's happening is we've revamped the Stranger Fiction website. So if you go to strangertv.com, you'll find the YouTube channel for this podcast, and you can, find this podcast and look at the video. If you're on Spotify, you can also look at the video right now. If you're not looking at the video, that's fine. I'll just tell you what I'm looking at, but I'm going to show you some things. And so, keep in mind that there's the video option in Spotify and on YouTube. And, possibly there's some other things I don't understand about the world where you can watch a video. In any case, please remember, this is an audio podcast, but I try to show you videos sometimes. What I'm looking at here, if you go to strangerfiction.ca, you'll see the website was recently altered. There's a number of things on this website that I think are worth checking out. So again, you can either look at the video, you can go to strangerfiction.ca yourself, you can just listen to me tell you. But of course, if you're on the site, I hope you noticed one, that we have we're featuring the actual things that we've published and some of the books I've written. So you'll see a combination of books you can actually get. It used to be you kind of had to click out to a different site to find this, and it just got a little confusing. But if you take a look, you can see the new arrivals here. Then we got the Thistle Grimoire, which is not actually in my hands yet, but it will be within a couple of weeks. We're gonna have this Grimoire in our hands. You want to get a hold of this book, man. This is the craziest book you'll ever see in your life. And I'll tell you more about it in the future. Moon Patrol, Jimmy Kimichik's, graphic novel is there. Last Breeds, which we didn't publish. Stranger Fiction did not publish Last Breeds, but Gunyear Books has published Last Breeds. But I've got copies. Gunyear has copies later. The world will have copies. You can get yours early from me. And from Gunyear, if you're in the States, please buy from Gunyear, not me. It's a real problem to send stuff to you in the States right now. But I've got, this book in Canada. And it's a fantastic book, Last Breeds. I'll show you if you're on the video, by the way. So again, it's got this slipcase that it comes in if you order from me or from Gunyear. It's fancy, collectible edition slipcase. I don't know if people can see it. Well, you can't see it if you're on the video, but if you're not on the video, what I'm talking about is this hardcover kind of it's a hardcover book. Then it's got a hard slipcase, and the slipcase has a magnetic seal. It's a real fancy, piece. It's branded, of course, by the publisher, Gunyear Books, and you can see some cool, art related to the press and their slogan, stories for the next generation of dreamers and thinkers. On the back, you'll see where the magnet seal clicks and closes. It says last breeds, this, a little bit specific to the book and so on. One of the nice things that subcase does is protect, of course, this hardcover, which is otherwise, pretty heavy duty in itself. Last Breeds has 3 covers, so I'm holding the Scott Henderson cover. Scott Henderson is the artist in the book primarily. There's some art by Gregory Kmichik as well, but the majority of the art, almost all the art, is Scott Henderson, who does this cover that I'm holding if you're looking at the video. But there's also 2 other covers that you'll see. And let me tell you what Scott Snyder says about Last Breeds. Scott Snyder, the biggest comic writer in the world, absolute Batman, Superman Unchained, Justice League. Scott Snyder, American Vampire. He wrote with Stephen King. Scott Snyder says Last Breeds is epic. I'm reading from the back of the book here. It blends the bombast of an old school action adventure with the intelligence of a modern day drama. So thank you, Scott, for that kind words. This is an experimental on some levels. You can see if you're looking online, there's this really cool, interesting color experiment that we did with how we colored Scott's art. It's got, a lot of sort of vibe, indie comic, experimental vibes along the lines of what I normally do. Plus, it's got the bombast, explosiveness, superhero style action that you'll find in a big 2 Marvel DC book. It's a bit more dark, maybe, a bit more violence. It's a dystopia sort of science fiction on some levels. It's, a sort of a character drama on some other levels too. So I think it's a really fantastic book. I'm really proud of it. It's probably one of the best things I've written, and in this case, co-wrote with Gregory Kmichik and Matt Medney. And there's some great work in there. Art by Scott Henderson, as I say, who you may know from the books that David Robertson writes and other things. Lenny Redchenka's in there as a letter. Zach Schuster did this incredible colors. Really turned out nicely, and I encourage you to check it out. Again, you can get it from strangerfiction.ca. You can also see the latest podcast episodes, strangerfiction.ca, and there's a couple other things up there. One is, you'll see this SFTV link. That'll just take you to the YouTube channel. We're going to try to do more on YouTube. One thing you'll notice is there's a submit button. I'm taking submissions from writers now. Now, I may be very slow to respond to your submissions, but I am taking your submissions. I've got one already in this format. Somebody properly submitted. I have a real particular set of guidelines. So, if you want to submit to Stranger Fiction, take a look at the website, strangerfiction.ca/submit. The other thing I just want to tell you about is don't forget to be, I had an interesting reminder, just a sort of a total side note here, but I had an interesting reminder of the sort of importance of physical media in this streaming age. It's been true that I have been focused more offline than online. You may know, if you know me, that I don't spend really any time on social media, that perhaps I should spend more time, marketing and things online, but I don't. Of course, I'm going to have to increase that in some ways. I'm trying to do it more, spend more time with long form content like this podcast, like doing YouTube videos and things like this. But fundamentally, I just don't have a lot of patience and time for some of this other stuff. But, people have been pushing me on the importance of it. You'll notice if you go to YouTube, I did a short, finally. I can't really take credit for it. Producer of this podcast, Dan Budbunker, pulled out an interesting clip of, me talking about a little sliver of something in one of the recent podcasts where I gave sort of a note about how to deal with producer notes. And Dan sort of carved it out and said, oh, this would be a great TikTok video or short or something. And I was like, I don't know, whatever. I was a little dismissive of it, I'll admit. But I said, fine, throw it up on shorts, whatever, we'll see. Anyway, people seem to like that short. I got to say, I was surprised how well it did. So, Dan if you're listening to this as you're editing it, you were right. The shorts is a good idea. Um, you know, it almost instantly got 1,000 views, which sort of indicates to me that probably I have been remiss with, doing things to promote this podcast. So, I do promise sort of more things in the world over the next little while, but, we're mostly trying to focus on doing the books, doing this podcast, doing some of the long form work. But I will try some of these shorter things. I can see, there's some appetite for shorter things. The other thing I just worth, back to the topic though, I was talking about in the, on some level there, physical media. I was reminded I've got a record behind me. If you're watching, the record is Super Slimy, which is a collaborative venture between the rapper Future and the rapper Young Thug. And Super Slimy came out in, I believe, 2017. It's a great record. If you're into rap and you like a style of Atlanta trap and so on, it's one of the, I think, the better collaborative records that you can find in that whole genre. Anyway, I was thinking about, as I often do, the song "Drip on Me" by Future, which contains some brilliant lyrics that I often teach in my university classes. So I was sort of throwing up this lyric again. And it just made me think I should listen to the song again. And I went to listen to it. And of course, lo and behold, it's gone. They've removed it from the album. Who knows why? I've got it on my record here, but you can't go find it on Spotify. You can't find it, uh, reliably via streaming. Of course, this is the world we're in, right? They'll just pull the things away from you. You don't own anything. You're renting it all. It's a good reminder that, when you have a physical object, they can't really take it from you in the same way. That they could just click and, boom, the song has disappeared as if it never existed. Who knows why? There's all sorts of strangenesses. I see all the time when my kids want to watch some movie. Around the holidays, Christmas time comes along, what happens? All the movies you could have watched for free easily disappear. They disappear mysteriously. You can only rent them. You can only, whatever. Thankfully I've got all these DVDs. But just an interesting reminder about how this world has been shifting and how we take for granted certain access to things. When I buy a record, I want the record forever. I don't want, to stream a thing and just temporarily have access to it. But of course, I make that concession on a certain level without realizing what it is that I'm conceding to. So these are all sort of preambular business, housekeeping items and just things I've been thinking about lately. But they do segue, I think, into the topic that I want to discuss, which is, what does the reader want? And in the course of this, I wanted to talk really specifically about the Eye Collector and some of the things that I've done in the Eye Collector. Similarly, the Eye Collector was a book you could have gotten. You could have bought it. It was orderable. It was, an ebook. It was online. Boom, it disappears. Only I have copies. Only Gregory Kmichik has copies. We'll get them back into the world. There's a publisher issue. We don't have ill will towards the publisher, Heavy Metal, but nevertheless, it's another example of the kind of thing where there's a permanency that you get used to when you grow up in the age that I did. In this digital age, it's very shady and strange. Not that Heavy Metal is shady and strange, but that the impermeability of or impermanence, I should say, of this whole digital realm. It was a thing you could order and then boom, you can't. Now, again, I've got some. Go to strangerfiction.ca if you want to buy some Eye Collectors, or find us at a con. In the future, we'll have, those books available again for you. We're working on that. But in the meantime, I'm going to kind of just walk you through something in the Eye Collector. Again, keep in mind, you could get some copies of this before they completely cease to exist. We do have a diminishing number of them, but they are around. But I think there's a great moment at the end of issue 2 and the start of issue 3, or what in the future is going to become issue 3 and 4. But there's a sort of moment where one issue ends, one chapter ends, and then another chapter opens. And in that situation, I think is some of the best writing I've ever done. And it's really precariously and specifically predicated and built on this comprehension I think I've managed to gather about what the reader wants and what the reader expects and how to deal with this reader expectation. But before we dive into the details of the eye collector and how kind of use a case study of how maybe you could write and utilize techniques and tricks once you understand this concept, let's talk about the broader concept, because I think it's very often misunderstood. It seems like an easy answer. And of course, there are some sort of easy answers on a certain level, but there are some great, weird, strange examples of people getting it wrong. And I would say what the reader wants, what the audience wants, let's just put it a little bit more broad. What the audience wants on some level is a thing that they are not always clear about, but often, of course, is an expectation you set, and then the audience falls into the expectation. What I mean by that is there's a level in writing, I think, where you're constructing the reader's desire. So what the reader wants, I would argue, is not necessarily a preconceived thing. There's a level where you sort of have to teach them what they want. You have to sort of instruct them about what they want. And you see this all the time, of course, in marketing. And what I mean by that is, think of movies or book marketing, but movie marketing, book marketing, a lot of it is predicated around promising something to the reader. And this is especially true in what we call high concept stories. So a high concept story is a story, especially we think about this in movies, a story where when you hear the concept, you immediately sort of have a set of expectations for the story. And there's a level where you kind of know whether you want to watch it or read it, and so on. So a classic, high concept story is, Jim Carrey's Liar Liar, the movie where Jim Carrey plays a lawyer who, through magical means, is cursed, in a sense, to not be able to lie. So it's not a great movie, but it's a nice, clean example of this idea. It's a lawyer who can't lie. Well, in the parlance of, social society, there's this stereotype that lawyers are always lying, right? What would it mean for the lawyer not to lie? We can see the hijinks. Again, the movie writes itself a little bit for you. There's a level where, one, it establishes that it's playing into the stereotype. Two, it establishes it's playing with and against a stereotype. Three, it establishes, a promise. It promises you, that Carrie is going to be in a courtroom saying the truth when he shouldn't. It's promising you that he's going to be forced to defend a client who that he knows is guilty, but he'll have to be pretending that the client is innocent. But now he can't. It's promising you that Carrie's a kind of a shady, slimy, sort of stereotypical bad lawyer. And now, he's forced to be the opposite of what he is trying to be. He's trying to be, he's forced to tell the truth. What a horrible thing for Carrie, the lawyer. But, of course, that is a lesson he must learn, that it's better to tell the truth, right? It all just writes itself in front of you. And, it's not my thing. And that's the point. The point is it's a high concept promise. There's an expectation that the writers have established, and the trailer plays into it. But the premise plays into it. The first few minutes of the movie are going to play into it, right? You have this establishment of, what this thing is. And we're very quickly determining what it is, and we're sort of teaching the audience what they need to expect. We're basically, you know, these sorts of movies and books are often very marketing led in the sense that when the concept is high like that, when the concept is like that clear, crystalline concept, again, it's promising the reader will or the audience will get a certain set of things. It's like saying, hey, we understand just as well as you do that this premise um, makes certain implications. It implies that certain things will happen. You will see those things happen. And of course, when the reader or the audience doesn't see those things happen, when there's sort of an implicit or explicit even promise being made by the writers that certain things will happen in the course of the story, and then they don't, well, the readers get very frustrated. The classic movie example I love to use of this is Jack and Jill by Adam Sandler. Another bad movie. But it's whereas Liar Liar is a good bad movie in the sense that it's bad from my point of view and so on. But it does what it says it will do. It's not my thing, but I get why a person would like it. That's that kind of middle American, middle of the road, don't have to think too much kind of audience members getting exactly what they've been promised. Sure, I get it. And a Sandler's Jack and Jill seems like that. It seems aimed at the same person on a certain level. This is a movie where one of the classically bad movies. It's a movie where Adam Sandler plays both Jack and Jill, twins, who, Jill loves Jack, wants to spend more time with him, has come to visit. Jack hates Jill, can't wait for her to leave, but she's not leaving. Turns out Jill has decided to stay indefinitely. Jack needs to figure out how is he going to get his horrible, annoying sister to leave. Not only does she drive him crazy, but she monopolizes his time, and also he's got problems at work and so on and so forth. Now, again, high concept, same sort of vein as Liar Liar in a demographic sense and so on. But here's the crazy thing about Jack and Jill. I just laid that premise out for you, right? And of course, the premise implies very clearly that you're going to see hijinks. Similarly with Liar Liar, premise is the guy can't lie, but he's a lawyer. Well, he's going to have to tell the truth when he should be lying. How is he going to do it? How is he going to get by? We don't know. But it'll be fun to see, won't it? Right? That's the idea. Similarly, Jack and Jill, the premise is really clear, really laid out. Jack can't stand Jill. Jill's staying indefinitely. Jack needs to get rid of Jill. Well, won't that be fun to see? Won't it be funny? All the different things that Jack does to try to get rid of Jill. Well, if you watch that movie, I defy you to find a single thing that he does to try to get rid of Jill. There's not one moment in that movie, not one moment where Jack does anything to get rid of Jill. In fact, all the things he does, if they worked, would keep her there longer. He thinks, I got to get Jill out of my hair. I know, I'll set her up on a date. Well, why would he do that? Why would you set her up on a date with guys in your town? If it goes well, she'll stay longer. There's all these things that happen that it's totally deranged. How poorly they seem to understand their own premise. And this is Adam Sandler, who, like him or hate him, he's a guy who knows how to make a movie people will watch, right? But Jack and Jill is a total misfire. Now, I love the movie for weird other reasons. It's a hilariously bad movie, and it's a brilliant example of a poorly constructed film, which I think is very instructive. It's very instructive to watch poorly constructed things. But here's the other weird thing in Jack and Jill. Again, keep in mind the demographic is aiming at, right? That sort of, low education, low intelligence, middle American, whatever. Not to throw stereotypes out, but that's sort of what the audience is aiming at. I think probably middle America is way smarter than Jack and Jill presumes they are, but Jack and Jill is presuming this kind of an audience member, right? It's presuming an audience member who just doesn't know things and won't even notice that Jack isn't doing anything to get rid of Jill, for example. Then, there's Al Pacino in a subplot, the understanding of which, to understand the Jack and Jill subplot where Al Pacino is featured, you must intimately, intimately know the novel Don Quixote. The Cervantes, his novel Don Quixote. If you don't understand in and out that novel, there's no way you can get even a basic comprehension of what is happening in the subplot of Jack and Jill. It's an absolutely deranged audience expectation that, expecting you on one hand to know the ins and outs of, early literature and some of the more famous yet somewhat obscure, rarely read examples. At the same time, expecting you to want to watch an Adam Sandler movie where he's like playing a woman in drag and also, it's just a totally bizarre construction. Again, that film does not know what the audience wants. It has no idea, and it's misfiring on all cylinders, just guessing that the audience wants to see Adam Sandler. The audience doesn't want to see Adam Sandler unless he's funny, right? Jack and Jill just, again, it's a classic mismatch or misapprehension of what the audience wants. What the audience wants is the fun in the games. What the audience wants is the premise hijinks. What the audience wants is this basic, hilarity ensues, right? We set up a premise, hilarity ensues. What the movie thinks the audience wants is Adam Sandler in drag. The movie is relying on the idea that Adam Sandler in drag is going to be funny, but it's not funny. It's just Adam Sandler in drag. Who cares? It's not interesting at all. It's neither shocking nor non-shocking. Like, it just has zero interest in and of itself. Weirdly, because Adam Sandler is a good actor. Weirdly, the fact that Adam Sandler is a good actor really starts to shoot the film in the foot, because now all of a sudden, when he's Jill, you kind of buy it a little bit. You kind of click out of the ridiculousness of the Sandler, cross-dressing, sort of what's supposed to be funny. It's not really a funny idea, but they think it's going to be funny. And the weirdness of it is he's good enough as an actor. He's actually quite an excellent actor. And so even when he's just sort of phoning it in, he's good enough that you sort of feel for Jill, which of course ruins the whole thing. The audience doesn't want to feel sympathetic for Jill. The audience wants to laugh at her pain. That's what comedy is about. Comedy is about laughing at people's pain. The second that we sympathize with them, it's not funny anymore. So there's often this genre expectation of what the audience wants, this marketing specific thing. Dialing it a bit more fully into literature, think about the romance genre for a second and think about books, shows, series, whatever you want to call them, that have a romance element. So the sitcom Friends was an example of a show that had a romance element running through it. Of course, in a romance novel, again, you've got this romance element. That is, in the case of the romance genre, fundamental. It's the core thing. And the thing that often writers in this genre don't understand particularly when they're pulling, like writers in the romance genre often understand this very well. But writers who pull romance elements out of that genre into another genre, for example, the writer who pulls, the romance element into Friends, or the writer who pulls the romance element into an action movie, or the writer who pulls a romance element into, some other thing. Unlike the romance author, who does usually fundamentally understand what the audience wants, the writer pulling the romance element often rarely understands what the audience wants, because the writer pulling the element often thinks, oh, the reader wants to see these two get together, but they don't. And you say to me, well, why? What are you talking about, John? Don't romance readers want the couple to get together? Well, in fact, no. Now, they may expect it to happen at some point at the end, but then the story is over. What the romance reader wants is for them to not get together. What the romance reader wants is obstacles to the relationship. They want to see the suffering of not being together. They want to see that escalate. They want to see it increasingly become impossible that these two could ever get together in a full way. If they do get together, immediately they got to get torn apart. And it was a mistake, they reject one another and so on, right? All the tropes fall in line with this idea that what the reader really wants is the torment of the two not being together. Now, at the end of the thing, when the story is over, they'll accept the two coming together. They may want it at that point, but not before. This is a huge mistake that you see a lot in television series. They'll set a romantic tension between two characters, and then at a later point in the series, they'll get those characters together. Because what they'll think is they'll set a romantic tension and then they'll see the audience reacting to the romantic tension. The audience likes this romantic tension, and they think to themselves, oh, what they'll really like is when the two get together. But that's actually the worst thing that you could do. If the audience likes the romantic tension, you can't eliminate it, right? If what the audience wants is the romantic tension, the will they, won't they, once you answer the question, it's over. The same is sometimes true in mystery. One of the films or TV shows, I should say, that I'm using a lot of TV show examples, but I'll move into the comic eye collector example in a second to show how you can really grind this down in a minuscule way and kind of deal with it moment by moment. But just again, a couple of other big examples. The original Twin Peaks series is by David Lynch is a fantastic example of this thing working and then not working. So those of you who watched or remember or have seen in later years the original Twin Peaks series by Lynch, unless you were alive at the time, you may have a hard time understanding how big that show was. That show was a massively popular show. And the core of that show, as far as the marketing was concerned, and the core of that show, as far as its sort of heart of a mystery was concerned, it was very cleanly organized around a very simply straightforward question. Who killed Laura Palmer? We have this murder of this young girl, Laura Palmer, that takes place. We have the mystery of who killed Laura Palmer. And then we have that as the initiating problem. Cooper, the detective, comes to town to try to solve the mystery of who killed Laura Palmer. And we go around, episode by episode, where one following Cooper trying to solve the mystery. But also we're just seeing how affected everybody in town is by this death and how it has had these ramifications in their lives in certain ways. whether they knew Laura Palmer and have been affected by it, or whether, they're a suspect and have been affected by that, or whether they just didn't really have a care about the situation exactly, but it started to bring a light and attention on them that they don't, and their own doings that they don't want, or whether they're just dealing with the situation in a weird, bad way, or what, or trying to, use it as an opportunity to, maybe advance themselves in some fashion. Everybody's sort of reacting to this absence that's suddenly felt in the town. And it's all revolving around this question, this, big concept question of who killed Laura Palmer. This is what the show is about. And every week we're tuning in on some level because we want to know who killed Laura Palmer, but really we don't. And that's the sort of key of it all. Lynch understood that who killed Laura Palmer was a bit of a MacGuffin, to use the Hitchcock term. It was just a thing that we were able to cohere a story around. It was just a sort of object, in a sense. It was this mystery. It was really just a thing that could be returned to and utilized as a structure and a network and a nexus point, or what was really of interest, which was, all these characters and how they were reacting and responding. And of course, Lynch, smartly understanding this, had the idea that he would never reveal who killed Laura Palmer. And of course, unfortunately, the show became a massive hit. The show became so successful that immediately it became the subject of studio meddling. And what did the studio decide had to happen? Well, of course, the studio heads think, well, everyone loves Twin Peaks. Wouldn't they love it more if they found out who killed Laura Palmer? And they forced Lynch to reveal who killed Laura Palmer halfway through the second season. Not at the end of the second season. Halfway through the second season. After which point, of course, almost everyone lost interest in the show. It starts to peter out narratively. Audience-wise, there's almost no interest in it anymore. Really, again, it seems like they want, and they may even think they want, to know who killed Laura Palmer. They may be tuning in every week thinking, oh, I wonder if I'll find out, get some more clues about who killed Laura Palmer. I wonder if I'll figure it out. But they don't want to figure out. They want to get more confused. They want to get further away from understanding who killed Laura Palmer. And the strangeness of what Lynch is always engaging in facilitated that. But, the audience, if you ask them, why they watch the show, they say things like, well, I want to know who killed Laura Palmer. Of course, they don't want to do that. But even if they did want to do that on a certain level, of course, again, the last thing you can do is give them the answer, like tell them give them what they want. The worst thing you can do is give somebody what they want, in that really sense. Now, at the same time, right, you can see shows where readers just get frustrated. Lost was a show that tried to learn the Lynchian lesson, but it wasn't focused enough. Lynch had an answer all the time. He just didn't want to give it to you. And then when they forced his hand, he had an answer and it made sense and so on and so forth. Lost, you could argue about what answers they had and what didn't. They started, again, expanding that show and so on. And it started to, become a frustrating sprawl that had no focus, which works for Lynch's Twin Peaks because he's just set it up as like, that's where we are and what we're going to do. Lost, they kind of promise initially that these things are going to tie together in sensible ways, which perhaps they should never have promised. But you have this idea, this expectation that, you have this mismatch. And this is often the case, often if you ask the audience what it wants, they will misreport. If you ask them what they want, they'll tell you like what they want to have happen at the end of the story. But of course, the end of the story is just a tiny little sliver. Mostly the rest of the story, they want the opposite. Mostly the rest of the story, they want a different thing. And whenever you can dictate what the audience wants to any degree, and then hold off giving them what they want, and if you do replace it with something else, that's usually a really useful and interesting tactic. Now, I'm going to talk about the eye collector for a little bit precisely here. If you're watching, I'm going to share screen, but otherwise I'll tell you again what I'm looking at here for the most part. And I want to understand that with the eye collector, again, we're talking about here the example of a thing that I wrote. You can again find the eye collector at strangerfiction.ca if you want to check out yourself. But again, I encourage you to take a look at the YouTube video here or the Spotify video, where I'm going to kind of walk through the comic a little bit. I'm going to show you part of there's an end of one chapter and the start of another chapter. So don't worry too much if you haven't read the eye collector or you're lost or you're not looking at a video. Again, I'll kind of make it all clear. So at the end of the one chapter, there's one of the things that happens early in the eye collector is Nathan, this young child. There's this mysterious man who's been visiting his father late at night in his study. Nathan decides to spy on his father, see what's going on with this man. He sneaks. So one night, what happens in the pages here is one night he sneaks into the study. He hides in this sort of strange object where, he seems a good hiding place. He can look out and he sees this interaction that his father has with the eye collector, who's sort of this amalgamation of the Sandman, the Man, the Moon, and the Boogeyman in my rendering here. So first he sort of sees his father take some drugs. Then the eye collector comes, and the eye collector has a little discussion with the father about points of view, what it means to be a father, and so on. And then of course Nathan is spying on all this stuff and we're seeing all this stuff sort of from his vantage point. And what becomes very clear very quickly is that eye collector knows that Nathan is there. And not only does he know that Nathan is there, but because he knows that Nathan is there, Nathan is cornered. Nathan, again, is hidden inside of a structure. Now the eye collector is at the door. So Nathan has been cornered by this eye collector. Then we have him, eye collector turn to Nathan, directly discuss the fact that he knows that Nathan is there. And then the cliffhanger of that chapter is this strange, surrealistic image. The eye collector is talking about, what does Nathan want? Well, why are you there and, hiding? Well, maybe it's that you want to be remade, reformed, and turned into a new thing. So he has a speech along these lines and this mysterious sort of invocation of the old ones. And meanwhile, in the image, it almost looks like Nathan or some person has, somehow caught on fire and also had their flesh stripped from them. Surrealistic. The image is very surrealistic compared to some of the previous images, which, although they have been, kind of informed by Gregory Kmiechik's odd surrealistic style, there is like a grounding and realism to them. There's like a geography of like a location. There's like a boy and he's looking out of a thing and he sees his dad. And then, the guy looks back at him and there's an object. He's inside the object. It has a door, like a circle. And then, of course, the door is a little bit ajar. The circle looks like a moon, crescent moon. There's a surrealism there and a strangeness to the imagery, but there's a geography. You can follow like what's going on. But, the last page, it's very unclear what we're looking at. We see this the house has been replicated in an Escher-like way in the background. The colors have gone off their standard sort of, schematic into the stranger space. We have this picture of this, body, this figure that seems partly to be Nathan, partly to be just totally defaced, partly to have lost its flesh. Perhaps is on fire. It's very unclear what has happened. And of course, what the reader wants to know, right? This is a bit of a cliffhanger here, right? What's going to keep you reading? What's going to make you pick up the next chapter, pick up the next issue? Well, you want to know what happened to Nathan. Now, please just sort of indicate or stop for a second and just realize what I'm indicating here. The particular scene has been built up towards a cliffhanger. To get the cliffhanger to work, what I've had to do, and what Gregor has had to do in the visuals as well, what I've had to do in the writing, what Gregor's had to do in the visuals, is we've had to really pace it as a tense scene, which plays out in a really steady manner, escalating from sort of real clean, scene structure. At the start, they don't know he's there. At the end, they know he's there, right? There's a real, shift from the negative to the positive in that sense, and so on, right? Or positive, you're not knowing a thing to knowing a thing, right? At the start, he seems to be safe. At the end, he's exposed and in danger, right? And there's a real, shift in value. Very clean, very standard Hollywood scene structure. And the cliffhanger that you get at the end of the issue, the end of the comic, the end of the, chapter, that cliffhanger is putting a question. So one, it's a climax to the scene. The eye collector has, done something to Nathan. But two, the question becomes, again, there's a question raised, what has the eye collector done to Nathan? And of course, what we want to know as readers is the answer to that question. If we're engaged by this point, we want to know the answer to the question, what has happened to Nathan? So, a lot of writers who manage to do this kind of thing, I think, would make a fundamental mistake next. Not to say that I'm the best writer in the world or anything, but I think I understand. I think one of my strengths, I've got weaknesses as a writer. I can't describe certain things very well. For example, I'm not great at writing description, but one of my one of my strengths as a writer, I think, is that I'm very good at establishing what a reader wants and then playing with that. And I mean playing with it in the cat and mouse sense. So now that you want to know what happens to Nathan, what's the proper opening to the next chapter? I think that a writer who doesn't really have a good handle on these things would be tempted to start issue 3 by answering the question of what happened to Nathan. And what I do is, for the half of the issue, we don't see Nathan. Instead, we jump. That issue opens, issue 3 jumps to Clara, Nathan's friend. We open with her, not Nathan. So immediately, I want to point out, there's a response to the fact that the reader wants to see Nathan. Because I have the reader wanting to see Nathan, because I have the reader wanting to know what happened to Nathan, the worst thing I could do is just answer that question. Finally, I've got some tension, right? I've got some tension. I need to hold the tension as long as I can, in my view. Why? Well, if I can hold the tension of you wanting to know what happened to Nathan, what I can do is transfer that tension to another thing. So anything I show you now is going to have behind it the tension of the reader wanting to know what happens to Nathan. And what I'm always looking for in these sorts of scenarios is there a character in the story already who can stand in for the reader? In other words, In this instance, Clara, our childhood friend of Nathan, Clara similarly would want to know what happened to Nathan. Let's imagine that Nathan hasn't been coming to school. Again, something happened to him. We don't know what. If I'm holding it back, right? If we're going to delay the revelation of what happened to Nathan, in the story's world, it would be reasonable for a similar delay to happen where, if Nathan just stopped, if something's happened to Nathan, he wouldn't continue his normal things. He wouldn't just be going to school. Clara wouldn't know why he's not coming to school. You know how kids are. Kids have they have like this lack of ability to get the answers to their questions in a weird sort of way. They can ask a question, but they can't always get the answer. So I can start with just Clara. Clara is a great stand-in for the reader because there's an anxiety that she would have about Nathan that I think mirrors the reader's anxiety about Nathan. And then I start to think, well, what is the anxiety? It's been established previously that Clara really has no friends. Nathan really has no friends. They're really each other's only friends. She's a very lonely girl. And I thought I will just hold with that loneliness and dig into just that feeling of being a child who doesn't understand what's going on around you. And the things you have can be taken away. Your friend can just suddenly not come to school one day because his family moved them out to another state. And you really never know why or what happened. You may never get a chance to say goodbye. There's all that kind of loneliness that I think a child can have. Never mind if the child has home problems or whatever, right? But even in a normal scenario, there's a weirdness where you have so little control of your universe. I think it's interesting mirror to the cosmic horror scenario that kind of the Lovecraftian eye collector is sort of playing into. And it's a great example or a great opportunity, I should say, of, let's just find the unsettling sense that the reader has that they don't know what happened to Nathan. They're kind of worried. Let's transfer that over to Clara, who similarly would be kind of worried, not knowing what happened to Nathan. And then let's just extend into this as an opportunity to flesh out Clara. Maybe the reader hasn't really been caring about Clara up to this point. They've been so focused on Nathan. Now they've got the anxiety and the concern about Nathan in the background. There's a reason for Clara to mirror that. And so there's a reason for them to empathize with Clara. And so if they can empathize with Clara, maybe we can start to kind of get them, more interested in Clara. I want to kind of do two birds, one stone, right? I want to hold that tension and that interest of the reader as long as I can, not answer the question, not give them the thing they think they want. And I also want to kind of take this character who I think has been getting short shrift. In my early drafts, the real frustration I had was that the female characters felt flat. But I was like, one of the reasons is just I wasn't spending enough time with the female characters, which is hard to do when the male character is the main character. But here's a great opportunity to focus on Clara. And in fact, as the eye character goes on, Clara starts to overtake Nathan and become a main character. She became a real powerful character in my view. And I would ultimately argue that she ends up being the most interesting character. But at this point, we're just starting to really establish the core of her. So I'm going to read the section here. There's a section of 5 pages that fall, like, again, keep in mind, this is a 22-page comic. So I've got, 5 of those 22 pages, which is a substantial amount. That's almost a quarter of the comic. We just spend with Clara, just setting forth sort of where she's at, what she's doing in Nathan's absence. So we're eating up almost a quarter of the comic like this, but I think it works. Personally, I think it's one of the better things I've written. I'm just going to read it because it's mostly seeing Clara. So again, you can see it as I scroll through if you want to look at the video, but you don't have to necessarily, because the captions sort of tell a narrating. Is that like this narrative voice that comes in and just sort of is talking in an abstract manner. Meanwhile, we see Clara doing things. And again, keep in mind the whole background of all this is the tension of, well, what happened to Nathan? What about Nathan? What about Nathan? And again, the last thing I want to do is talk about Nathan, right? I don't even want to talk about Clara in a weird sort of way. I want to just talk about the situation Clara's in, but at this broader scale. And so here's the captions and the narration. When you are a child, you understand nothing and you are afraid. When you are old, you still know nothing, but you are less afraid. Because you become acquainted with death. You grow to think of the world as your friend, but the world hates you. You have no friends. And of course, as we're hearing that little meditation, we're just seeing this girl all by herself, this little lonely girl without her friend. Gregory has an amazing moment in the visuals. He's drawn the one panel where it's just Clara sort of walking home from school, but the eye catcher's long arm is just behind her, like it's about to touch her. That visual is so powerful. I didn't tell him to draw that. That's just something that he added. And of course, it perfectly represents how I wanted it to feel. But like, I find that the visual heartbreaking. I think that little panel is one of Gregory's best works. And then if you turn the page to the next spread, it's just, the poor little Clara lonely on the swing. Gregory's drawn this. I can't remember I think I told him to draw this, but I can't remember. I know I told him to draw Clara alone on the swing, but I didn't ever anticipate this composition. He's drawn it. So you just see this swing, like ropes coming down, and little Clara, she's about almost 2/3 of the way up the page. So it's like she's hanging in the air with nothing below her. And even just, you can't even see the bar above her. There's just nothing in this composition. It's just so lonely. Just this beautiful little thing. Very quiet moment. Gregory will often, fill a page with noise, visual noise. But he can do these quiet moments. Anyway, so there's 5 pages of that, right? Now we get this, like, what I think works out quite nicely. I'm proud of my little speech there, but I think what sells it is, Gregory really balancing it and leaving that quietness, like where my speech stops, and then it just keeps going visually into this really powerful space. But now, I've held you back a little bit, right? The next thing that we're going to have to do in the story is start to get closer. Like by this point, the reader maybe is like, okay, now I love Clara, but I still want to know what happened to Nathan. We've had enough of Clara right now, right? Okay, well, again, Clara's going to be our entry point into Nathan and figure out what happened to him. It's the reasonable way to get at the solution of what happened to Nathan is for Clara to try to find out. We've established via her motivation to go find her friend, call on him, in other words, go to his house, knock on the door. Where's Nathan? So that's what's going to happen next. What's nice about that is, one, it gives me a nice transition from, this Clara alone to, Clara with Nathan, and bringing Nathan back into the story, connecting the two again. But also the fact that I have the opportunity to have her go, try to find out what happened to Nathan. Again, there's a reader stand-in aspect of it. The reader wants to know what happened to Nathan. They would go to Nathan's house. They want me to go to Nathan's house, right? They want to see Nathan again in his house. What happened in the house? But we get this with Clara. If we keep following Clara, we get to, again, delay it a little bit, because we can have, another spread where Clara first interacts with the mother and the father. Then she gets to see Nathan. She has to pay her dues to see Nathan. So, we see her go up to the house. Gregory's got a really nice little weird visual of the house. She knocks. Mom, says hello behind the door. And then we see Clara, hopeful Clara's face in the door. Can Nathan come out to play? And then the mother, I love this moment. And I'm very proud of this moment, by the way. You know, she's like, "Oh, can Nathan come out to play again?" What you would, the easy way, right? The easy way to get the sense of, oh, hey, Nathan, is he okay? Can he come out to play? Is he feeling better? Whatever. No, dear, I'm sorry, but you can come inside. So now you love Clara. Let's just threaten her, right? Now that you love Clara, let's invite her in to the horror. Um, you know, the sort of thing that I'm starting to establish here, and that Gregory's visually starting to establish is, oh, this girl's going to get caught up in it. Whatever happens in Nathan's house, it's going to spill over. And of course, that starts to become more and more the focal point here. Then we have, Mom and Clara talking again. We're just trying to delay the revelation as long as possible. We get 13 pages halfway through this issue over halfway through the issue before we actually see Nathan again. So Nathan, so Mother is, talking to Clara. Nathan's in bed. My, so pretty. Do you have a name, dear? And she has to give her name, Clara. And, she's small, individual, saying the word Clara. We have Gregory has put all these eyes, in the walls and on the plate and, things, right? One of the things that's happening here that's kind of been set up previously is in the previous issue, the eye collector had learned that Nathan liked a girl at school and he wanted to know the name of the girl. And Nathan refused to say her name. Well, now he's learned her name. Right. So there's a bit of a callback. There's a follow-up from a previous idea. Again, we're trying to deepen the notion that Clara is getting into this situation she can't understand. And there's, some danger for her here. Then we finally see Nathan again. We just see him in silhouette in the background. He doesn't get to say anything on this page. We just see him in silhouette, and Mother is like saying, Nathan, Clara's here. And then we have Father come up, Clara. And Father, of course, is again hammering home this idea that the eye collector is taking an interest. We last saw Father with the eye collector, working with the eye collector in his study. So the eye collector is sort of behind Father in a way. And of course, visually, Gregory puts that eye collector behind Father in a certain sense. So, and we have the sort of polite, conversation that really, for us, for the reader, is going to read as a threat. Father says, Clara, a beautiful name. They'll have to get to know you better, Clara, but I'll leave you two alone for now. I must get back to work. And of course, Linda Letter has, a hit work to make it really resonate. Greger's drawn the eye collector's hand in an eye, kind of behind Father. Clearly, Clara doesn't see that, but we see it, right? Just kind of, again, we've now drawn Clara fully into this situation. She doesn't realize that there's a situation. She doesn't realize what the situation is. She doesn't realize how dangerous the situation could be. She doesn't realize, anything. And the reader doesn't either. The reader wants some answers. But again, we can delay those answers now. Now the reader really has learned that Nathan's still alive. The reader has learned that, Clara is in danger. She's been drawn into it. The reader can be satisfied with the answer to the question they had of, well, what happened to Nathan? Because no longer is that the question they care about. Now there's a new question. What does the eye collector want with Clara? Now that's the question. So now I've supplanted your desire as a reader to know something with this newer, bigger desire. Well, now that you've got a newer, bigger desire, well, I can just satisfy your previous desire. Right? What happened to your face? Clara asks. I fell down the stairs. And the mother comes in sleepwalking. Of course, with the Sandman, the dream man, has a strange, horrible resonance. It is also logical that Nathan might be sleepwalking. Maybe he did dream that whole interaction in the office. We saw him go to bed, then we saw him, get out of his room, and all these strange things happened. Is it that he was sleepwalking? Is this all a dream? There's a lot of questions in the eye collector, but uh, the core here is that none of that stuff matters anymore. All that is that this isn't the explanation. Again, but it serves, right? And I want to just point out the thing that I've done here is a bit of a bait and switch, right? Um, because of course, the reality is that I have never answered the question of what happened to Nathan in that room. The answer I give you is an obvious lie. Like mother says, oh, well, what happened to him was he was sleepwalking and he fell down the stairs. Nathan says, I fell down the stairs. Maybe he believes it, but it seems like he can't possibly believe it. Seems like he's covering something up. Mother says sleepwalking again. Seems like an obvious cover up to us. Well, what's being covered up? We don't need to know. It doesn't matter. What happened in that study, all we need to know about it is that now Nathan is in this mess. He's been seen. The eye collector has hold of him. And because of that, everything in his life is in danger, including Clara. And now the stakes have shifted, right? I've shifted the stakes right off of Nathan to Clara because of, Nathan and Clara, there's an escalation that's kind of going there. But again, it's a bit of a bait and switch because I've cliffhangered in chapter 2 or at the end of the previous chapter. I've cliffhangered this idea that you want to know what happened to Nathan in that room. When I've opened the new chapter, I've just delayed that revelation because what I think I understand is that the person who's really attuned to this story, ultimately they're not going to care about that. The person who attuned to the story wants to know how is Nathan going to get out of this situation? How is he going to get out of it intact? If he hasn't already died, once he established that he hasn't already died, the question then becomes, is he going to be able to survive contact, stay himself, or is he going to become like a marionetted puppet like his mother and father seem to be? And if he does become some sort of marionetted puppet, like, tool of the eye collector, well, what that means, of course, is that the thing is really after Clara, right? And that's sort of the thing that's happened here is, I've started to kind of take the reader's interest and start a bait and switched it a little bit. I've sort of started to establish like, well, really, here's the non-answer to your question. But by the time you get your non-answer, it's become clear that you're asking the wrong question. What happened to Nathan isn't the important thing. This is a story about Clara, and what's going to happen to her. And of course, as the story develops, you'll see more and more, why this is the case. But, that level of control, I mean, I've done it a lot worse. I'm proud of this particular one. So I'm using it as an example. Please don't think that I always pull it off the way that I think I did here. I'm often failing, like most of us, to comprehend what the reader really wants. And it's tough because the reader is not there telling you what they want. You have to do a bit of detective work. You have to think through the history of the genre. So one, you have to think through, again, the expectation you're setting. And I think a lot of times writers can run into problems when they're not clear on what expectation they're setting. In other words, what is interesting about your own idea? When you've got a premise, an idea, when you're initiating a story and you've got some conflict that's structuring the story, you need to really spend some time thinking through what's actually interesting about that to a reader. Not just what do I think is interesting as the writer, but what to a reader is interesting. And then also you got to think a bit through like the dynamics. Again, maybe the reader would report to you they want to see these two people get together, or maybe they would report to you they want to see like this guy beat this guy. But do they really want that? They might want it at the very end. But really, what they want is to see the failures and the struggle, because that's interesting. That's what they actually are there for, right? Because that's the story. The problems, failing to overcome the obstacles, and everything getting worse is the story on a core level. And that's really what the reader is there for. They're there to see it not work out. Maybe they ultimately might want it to happen, but you got to be really wary of giving the reader what they want too soon. One, maybe you don't want to give it to them at all. But if you're going to give it to them, you got to be very clear that you're not doing it too soon. And then I think the really high level set of techniques here is just on a page by page, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, basis. What are you teaching the reader to want? What are you making the reader want? What are you refusing to let them have so they keep wanting it? What are you going to give them when? And don't be afraid as a writer to delay gratification. Again, once you gratify the reader, once you give them the thing they want, once they're satisfied, their interest is gone. You have to kind of keep it in that thing in mind. On one hand, if you never satisfy the reader, they're going to get frustrated with you. If you satisfy the reader, their interest is gone. It's very, similar in some ways to dating in the sense that you need a little bit of mystery. You can't just be totally, you know, if you do everything that the person wants all the time, it's cloying. They experience it as cloyingness. They experiencing it as suffocation. Yes, they want you to do things that they want you to do. Yes, they're going to get frustrated if you just are contrarian and always being pushing back against them for things. But at the same time, if you do every single thing they ask you to do, they're just going to experiencing it as a boredom. They're going to experience it as suffocation. If they can predict everything that you're going to do, there's no excitement for them. Sure. Do they want you to be erratic? Do they want you to be unreliable and undependable? No. But nor do they want you to be, always giving them what they want. But they want you to, sort of surprise them on some levels, right? Maybe not every day. But, the reader is sort of, a bit more difficult to satisfy in a certain sense. The reader really doesn't thrive on reliability. The reader, does not want what they think they want. The reader is dying for you to do something other than what they think they want. And it's, it's often bad advice to say, why don't you give the reader the answer to that question? Often, the only reason to give the reader the answer to a question they have is if you've already made them want the answer to a bigger question, and now they barely care about this thing anymore. So sure, give me the answer. That establishes that you will give me answers. Now you're training me to expect that you will satisfy me. But at the same time, I want a bigger and better thing right now. And so I still have an interest. I still want to kind of follow you where you want to go. The reader will follow you much farther than you expect if you can kind of pull them along in that sort of a way. Again, if you can kind of satisfy them as you're sort of dissatisfying them on a certain level, satisfy them while or just after you've made them want a new thing. It's a balancing act. It's a trick. It takes a lot of drafts, it takes a lot of learning, takes a lot of practice. But when you pull it off, which you can't always do. But when you pull it off, it's, those are often some of the most satisfying parts in your writing journey, I think. And the things the reader will remember, I think, the most. This has been Writing the Wrong Way, where we talked about how writing works, how writers work, why the best writers risk being strange. Thanks for listening. Keep writing the wrong way.